The moment Jedediah Watkins dropped to one knee in the dirt beside Ella Brenner's ruined garden, every soul in Harlan Creek who happened to glance that direction stopped breathing. Not because the great Cattleman was kneeling, though that alone was enough to make a grown man rub his eyes, but because of the way he looked up at her. That proud, iron-jawed face that had never bent to weather, banker, or rival rancher was stripped of every wall he had ever built, and what showed beneath was something raw and desperate and entirely forbidden by everything Jedediah Watkins had ever believed about himself. Ella stood over him with a trowel in her hand and tears drying in tracks on her dusty cheek, and she did not move. She could not. 3 days ago she had told him to leave her property and never return. She had meant every syllable. She had rehearsed that command through 2 sleepless nights and delivered it without trembling, which was the greatest act of courage she had ever performed. And yet here he was, hat in hand, knee in her scorched earth, the afternoon sun of 1878 Texas burning the back of his neck the same way it burned everything else in this unforgiving territory. "Tell me what to plant," Jedediah said, and his voice was rough, as though the words had fought their way out through stone, "and I will do the rest." The silence that followed was the loudest thing Ella had ever heard. She looked at his hands, those enormous cattleman's hands that managed 10,000 acres and 200 head of longhorn, and had never once been offered in service to anything smaller than ambition. They were open now, turned upward, resting on his thighs, waiting. The gesture was so contrary to everything she knew of him that it cracked something loose inside her chest. "You do not even know what you are asking," she said. "No," he admitted, "but I know I have been wrong. And I know that garden is the only thing in Harlan Creek that matters more than my pride. And I know I cannot fix what I have done with anything except my hands and your direction." She stared at him for another long breath, and then the whole, tangled, heartbreaking story of how they had arrived at this precise, impossible moment came back over her like a wave, and she had to look away at the horizon before she drowned in it. It had begun, as most betrayals do, with a secret that was never supposed to become a trap. Ella Brenner had arrived in Harlan Creek, Texas, in the early spring of 1878, traveling alone on the Southern Pacific Line with 2 trunks, a leather satchel of seed packets, and a determination so fierce it kept other passengers from asking her nosy questions. She was 26 years old, recently widowed, and in possession of a 40-acre parcel of land that her late husband, Thomas Brenner, had purchased by mail 2 years before his death. Thomas had been a gentle dreamer who believed the Texas frontier would give them a new start. A fever had taken him in Missouri before the start could begin, leaving Ella with the deed, the grief, and a choice. She could have sold the land and returned to her family in Ohio. Her mother had begged her to, but Ella had looked at the deed, and then at the window of the small boarding house room in St. Louis where she had been stranded, and she had made a decision that frightened even herself. She would go. She would build what Thomas had dreamed, not as a monument to him, but as proof to herself that she could survive the kind of loss that was supposed to destroy a woman. Harlan Creek in the spring of 1878 was a town of roughly 400 souls balanced on the knife's edge between civilization and something considerably more dangerous. There was a general store run by a man named Horace Gill, a church that doubled as the schoolhouse, a doctor's office that also served as the barber's, 2 saloons that served exactly the function you would expect, and a land registry office where Ella's paperwork was processed by a nervous young clerk who kept dropping his stamp. The town was dominated in every sense of the word by the Watkins spread. The Double W Ranch sat on the high ground northwest of town and ran cattle across the better part of the valley. Jedediah Watkins was 32 years old, had built the operation from the remnants of his father's failing homestead through pure, grinding, relentless work, and had become exactly the kind of man that success in a hard land tends to produce. Capable, direct, accustomed to being obeyed, and so armored against vulnerability that most people who met him assumed he had simply been born without the softer regions of the human heart. He was not unkind, precisely. He paid his hands fairly and kept his word when he gave it. But he was proud in the bone-deep way of men who have earned every inch of what they have and never forgotten a single cost, and that pride had a sharp edge that cut people who came too close to what he considered his. The 40 acres that Ella Brenner had inherited by marriage and deed happened to sit along Crooked Creek, which fed directly into the southern pasture of the W. Jedediah had been trying to acquire that parcel for 3 years. He had offered Thomas Brenner a fair price by mail twice. Thomas had declined politely, explaining he intended to work the land himself. Then Thomas had died, and Jedediah had assumed, not unreasonably given the frontier realities of 1878, that the widow would sell. He had prepared a new offer. He had been composing it in his head during the 3 days it took Ella Brenner to unload her trunks at the parcel, nail her windows shut against the dust, and begin turning soil with a spade she had bought from Horace Gill's store, before anyone had thought to tell him she had arrived. It was his foreman, a weathered man named Cass Dooley, who finally came into the ranch kitchen one evening and said, "The Brenner widow is on the property. She has been there 3 days. She appears to be staying." Jedediah had set down his coffee cup, which was the only visible sign of surprise he allowed himself, and ridden out the next morning to introduce himself and make his offer. He had not expected Ella Brenner. He did not know, riding up to that parcel in the early light, what he had expected exactly, but it was not the woman who straightened up from her digging and looked at him with eyes the precise color of storm-approaching sky, gray with flecks of something that might have been challenge or might have been humor or might have been both at once. She was tall for a woman of that era, and her dark hair was pinned severely back in the way of someone who considers loose hair a practical hazard rather than a decoration. She had dirt on her hands and a streak of it along her jaw, and she looked at his horse and then at him with the same calm, assessing expression, as if she were deciding whether either of them was worth her time. "Mr. Watkins," she said, which told him she had already asked around. "Mrs. Brenner," he said, and swung down. He was not in the habit of conducting business from horseback with women, whatever else his habits were. He had made his offer. It was fair. He had said so and meant it, and expected the conversation to be brief. Ella had listened to all of it without interrupting, which he respected, and then said, "No thank you, Mr. Watkins. I intend to work this land myself." He had looked at the parcel, at the soil, which was not the worst in the valley but was not easy, at the cabin, which had not been lived in since an earlier homesteader had abandoned it 5 years prior and would need significant repair before winter, at the woman herself, who was clearly intelligent and equally clearly not someone who had spent much time on a frontier. "With respect, Mrs. Brenner, this is rough country for a woman alone." "Most country is rough for a woman alone," she said, without heat. "I have found that to be a poor reason to stay indoors." He had not had an answer for that, which was unusual enough to lodge in his mind as he rode back to the W. He had ridden out thinking about water rights and come home thinking about gray eyes and the precise, unimpressed quality of her voice, and that disturbance had annoyed him considerably. He had not gone back. He had told himself it was because he was a busy man with a ranch to run, and that the widow Brenner would come to her senses about the land within a season. He had told himself a number of things over the following weeks, none of which entirely explained why he kept track of what was happening on that parcel through reports from Cass Dooley and from the general talk at the general store. What was happening, as it turned out, was impressive. Ella Brenner worked from before dawn to after dusk. She had the cabin repaired by hiring 2 of the town's underemployed men at a fair wage, directed the work herself, and was back digging the same day the last nail went in. She had brought seeds, not the corn and sorghum that most homesteaders planted for survival, but vegetables, beans, squash, carrots, onions, and an astonishing variety of herbs. She had a notebook full of planting charts that she consulted with the seriousness of a general reviewing maps. She had also, within 3 weeks of her arrival, made herself known at the church, joined the small group of women who organized the school schedule, and quietly become the person that other women in Harlan Creek went to when something was wrong, because she listened without judgment and thought before she spoke. The town loved her in the careful, guarded way that frontier towns love newcomers who prove themselves useful without demanding attention. Jedediah learned all of this secondhand, and the portrait it built in his mind was inconvenient in ways he could not precisely name. He was a man of organized thoughts and clear priorities, and Ella Brenner kept appearing in parts of his mind where she had no business being. The first time they spoke again after that initial meeting was at the 4th of July gathering in town, 6 weeks after her arrival. The whole community came out for it, which in Harlan Creek meant a long table of food in the churchyard, a fiddle player named Pete who was enthusiastic if not technically gifted, and the particular social dynamics of a small, isolated settlement where everyone knew everything about everyone and still managed to pretend otherwise. Ella was standing near the food table when Jedediah arrived, talking with the doctor's wife, and she nodded at him when their eyes met with exactly the same calm, self-contained courtesy she had offered at their first meeting, as though 6 weeks of him acquiring information about her from every available source had not occurred, which of course she had no way of knowing about, and which therefore produced in him an entirely unreasonable feeling of guilt. He crossed the churchyard to speak with her because it was the polite thing to do, which was the story he told himself. "Your garden is progressing well, I hear," he said. "It is," she said. "The soil is better than it looked. I think there was a previous attempt at cultivation years back. The ground has some memory of it. The Haverson homestead. They worked it for 2 years before the drought in '73 drove them east." "You know your land," she said. "I know this valley," he said, and there was something in the distinction he drew that she caught because her eyes shifted in that considering way. "It is not your land, though," she said, not unkindly, simply stating the fact. "No," he agreed. "Not all of it." The fiddle started up, and the conversation was swallowed by noise and movement, and Jedediah went to speak with the county assessor about a drainage matter that needed addressing, but he noticed for the rest of the evening where Ella Brenner was in the room, the way a man notices weather coming from the wrong direction. It was August before the thing between them became something more complicated than a property dispute with complicated feelings attached. August in Texas in 1878 was brutal in the direct, physical way of a punishment. The heat was not the ambient warmth of summer elsewhere, but something with weight and intention, pressing down on everything that tried to grow or breathe. The creek ran lower. The cattle drifted to whatever shade existed. The town moved slower and tempers moved faster. It was in that heat that Ella's well went bad. She had been drawing water from the property's existing well, which was shallow and had been dug by the Haverson family before the drought. In mid-August, something got into it. She later determined it was a small animal that had fallen in and died, and the water turned. She discovered it on a Tuesday morning, and by Tuesday afternoon she was in a real problem. The garden was a week from its first significant harvest. The cabin had no alternative water source, and the creek was low enough that walking to it twice a day with buckets was a day's labor in itself. She went to town to consult with the general store about a replacement pump. Horace Gill told her the part she needed would take 6 weeks to arrive by freight, which in August heat was effectively a death sentence for the garden. She was walking back from the store, turning the problem over in her mind with the focused urgency of someone who does not have the luxury of panicking, when she met Jedediah Watkins coming out of the land registry office. He looked at her face, which she had kept carefully neutral in the store and which she had evidently relaxed the moment she thought she was unobserved, and said, "What happened?" she told him. It was practical information and he had asked directly, so she answered directly because that was her way. He listened and then said, "The Double W has a water wagon. I will have it at your property tomorrow morning." She stopped. "I cannot afford to hire your water wagon, Mr. Watkins." "I am not offering to hire it to you," he said. "I am offering to lend it." The word lend sat between them with implications they both chose not to examine too closely in the middle of the main street of Harlan Creek. "That is a significant offer," she said carefully. "It is a practical one," he said. "Your land is downstream of mine. If your well situation goes unaddressed, it becomes a contamination problem for the whole creek system. I have a self-interested reason for solving it." It was the right thing to say. It gave her a way to accept without obligation, or at least with a clear accounting of the obligation. She recognized the courtesy in the framing, and she accepted. The water wagon came the next morning, driven by Cass Dooley's younger brother, a good-natured man named Abel who smelled of horses and talked about them constantly. Jedediah came with it. He told himself he had business in that direction. He told himself several things on the ride over, none of which addressed the actual reason he had chosen to ride out personally rather than simply send Abel. Ella was in the garden when they arrived, already working in the early morning before the heat settled in, and she straightened and shaded her eyes with her hand to watch the wagon come up the track. She was wearing a plain gray dress and her hair was pinned back as always, and there was already a smear of earth on her forearm, and Jedediah Watkins felt something shift in his chest the way a foundation settles. He set Abel to work connecting the water wagon's hose to the garden's irrigation channels, which Ella had dug herself in a pattern that immediately struck him as intelligent. She had read the slope of the land and directed the flow to reach every row without wasted effort. "You have some knowledge of irrigation," he said. "I have some knowledge of observation," she said. "I watched how the rain ran when we had it and directed accordingly. Most people dig their rows first and think about water second. Most people have access to water when they need it," she said simply. They walked the garden together then, in the early morning before Abel had the hose connected, and Ella explained what she had planted and where and why, in the matter-of-fact way of someone who assumed her knowledge was worth explaining rather than minimizing. She knew her plants with a precision that startled him. She knew their companion benefits, their soil requirements, their water needs, the intervals between planting and harvest. She had a whole system working in that garden that was not random or decorative but deeply thought through, and it produced in Jedediah a respect that was entirely separate from anything else he was feeling, and therefore somehow more dangerous. "Where did you learn this?" he asked. "My grandmother," she said, "and books, and trial and error over 3 gardens in Ohio and Missouri before this one." She paused among the bean rows. "And Thomas, my husband. He was not a gardener himself, but he found books for me everywhere we went. He had a talent for finding the right book for whatever I needed to know next." It was the first time she had mentioned Thomas to him voluntarily, and the quiet tenderness in her voice when she said it was the kind of thing that told Jedediah everything about the shape of a marriage without needing details. "He sounds like a good man," Jedediah said. "He was," she said, and then quietly, "he would have loved this valley. He had a way of seeing the best in landscapes. I sometimes think he would have seen it better than I do." The admission of grief was so understated that it hit harder than dramatics would have. Jedediah did not say anything because there was nothing adequate to say, and silence was at least honest. Abel got the hose connected, and the water wagon did its work, and Ella's garden did not die in the August heat. The new pump part arrived from freight 6 weeks later as promised. The well was cleared and resealed by a man from town, and the water wagon returned to the W, but something had shifted in the interval that could not be unshifted. Jedediah found reasons to ride past the Brenner parcel in September. Ella found reasons to be visible when he did, which she would not have admitted to any living person including herself. They talked over the fence on 3 separate occasions, conversations that lasted longer each time and covered more ground than either of them had intended. He told her about the valley's history, the Comanche presence that had retreated north under government pressure, the water patterns in drought years versus flood years, the particular stubbornness of the soil in different sections. She told him about her planting schedule for the fall, her plans for a cold frame to extend the growing season, her thoughts about what Harlan Creek's women might need in the way of a properly stocked kitchen garden that could supplement the general store's often limited fresh produce. "You are thinking of supplying the town," he said. "I'm thinking of making myself useful enough to stay," she said, with the directness that he had come to recognize as her primary mode of honesty. A woman alone in a frontier town needs a reason to be here that the town can understand and value. A garden that feeds people is a reason they can understand. "And the reason you can understand," he asked, which was a more personal question than he had previously allowed himself. She looked at him for a moment. "That it is mine," she said. "That I built it. That when I am here in the morning before the heat and everything is growing, I can feel that the world has not ended, even though there were months when I was certain it had." He had not known what to do with that answer, so he had nodded and ridden back to the W and spent the evening in the unsettled state of a man whose orderly internal world has been handed a problem it does not have the right category for. October came with cooler mornings and the first real harvest from Ella's garden, and it was everything she had planned and then some. The beans had produced abundantly. The squash were large and healthy. The carrots and onions were excellent. She brought baskets to the church and to the general store and to several of the town's families who she knew were struggling. And Harlan Creek looked at what she had built on that difficult parcel in a summer that had broken other people's efforts, and began to understand that Ella Brenner was not a temporary problem to be waited out. Jedediah Watkins understood it too, and the understanding brought with it a crisis of purpose, because a permanent Ella Brenner on that parcel meant the land was permanently unavailable to the W, and he had built the last 3 years of expansion plans on the assumption that it would eventually be his. And separately, entirely separately, a permanent Ella Brenner in Harlan Creek meant something else, something that he examined at night with the particular discomfort of a man confronting a feeling he has no established procedure for. It was the autumn social, in early October, that changed everything between them, and not in the direction either of them expected. The autumn social was held in the church again, a larger affair than the 4th of July gathering, with a proper meal and the fiddle player Pete reinforced by a man with a harmonica who was genuinely talented and made Pete sound better by association. The whole town came, and there was dancing, which was one of the few pleasures Harlan Creek offered that required no apology. Jedediah arrived late, as was his habit, having always some final business at the ranch that needed attending before he could justify leaving it. He came in to find Ella Brenner dancing with the new schoolteacher, a young man named Everett Cross who had arrived from St. Louis 2 weeks prior, and who was 24 years old, and had a pleasant face and clearly excellent manners, and was looking at Ella with an expression that Jedediah recognized instantly and deeply disliked. The feeling that hit him standing in the doorway of the Harlan Creek Church was entirely disproportionate to any rational account of his relationship with Ella Brenner, and he knew it, and it helped not at all. He had a drink at the table set up for punch, which was largely symbolic, and he spoke with several people, and he watched Ella dance twice more with Everett Cross, and once with the blacksmith's husband, and once with Abel Dooley, who was an enthusiastic if unskilled dancer, and he catalogued it all with the grim precision of a man conducting surveillance on his own feelings. When the music paused and Ella came to fill her punch cup, she found him standing nearby and offered her usual calm nod. "You are not dancing," she observed. "I do not dance," he said. "Everyone dances," she said. "Not everyone." She tilted her head in that considering way. "Is it that you cannot, or that you choose not to, or that you are afraid you will not be good at it?" The question was not mocking, but it was precisely aimed, and it found the thing it was looking for, which was a man who avoided anything he could not do well. "I notice the schoolteacher finds you an excellent partner," he said, which was not an answer, and both of them knew it. Something moved in her eyes. Amusement, maybe, and something sharper. "Mr. Cross is a pleasant young man," she said. "He is," Jedediah agreed, with a neutrality so studied it would have been obvious to anyone listening. "Jedediah," she said, and it was the first time she had used his given name, and it had exactly the effect you would expect, which was that every careful construction he had been maintaining around his feelings developed a significant structural problem. "You are either going to say what you mean, or you are going to spend the rest of this evening being quietly miserable about it. I find I would prefer the first option." The boldness of it ought to have annoyed him. Instead, it produced something that was dangerously close to joy. "I find," he said carefully, "that I am not as indifferent to your circumstances as I first represented myself to be." "I know," she said. "You know." "I have known for some time," she said. "I was waiting to see what you would do with it." He looked at her for a long moment. "And what have you decided?" "I have not decided anything," she said. "I am waiting for you to do something first, since you are the one who keeps riding past my fence on business that does not require passing my fence." He was quiet. And then, unexpectedly, the corner of his mouth moved in a way that she had never seen it move before, which was toward something that was not quite a smile but was its immediate predecessor. "Would you walk with me?" he said. "Outside where it is cooler." "Yes," she said. "I would." They walked in the autumn dark of Harlan Creek, along the main street where the light from the saloon doors made yellow rectangles on the packed dirt, and they talked for an hour and a half. Not about the land. Not about water rights or crops or frontier practicalities. They talked about Ohio and Missouri and what Thomas Brenner had been, and they talked about Jedediah's father, a bitter man who had beaten the land and the luck and the joy out of everything he touched, and how Jedediah had learned from him primarily by determining to be the opposite, and what that cost. They talked about books, because Ella read constantly and had opinions, and it turned out Jedediah read too, in the evenings, which was not something most of his hands knew about him, because he had learned early that certain things survived better as private. They walked back to the church, and the music was still going, and Everett Cross was dancing with someone else, and Jedediah looked at Ella in the lamplight from the church windows and felt the weight of every wall he had built settle differently, as if they had always been meant to become a door rather than a barrier. "I would like to call on you," he said. "Properly." "I know what properly means in Harlan Creek," she said, "and I am not sure that is what I want." He waited. "I mean," she said, and something shifted in the straight composure of her face, a brief vulnerability that she did not usually allow to show, "that I do not want to be a polite arrangement with understood objectives. I was married to a kind man and I loved him truly, and the grief was real. I do not want anything that begins from a starting point of social maneuver." "What do you want?" he asked. "I want something honest," she said. "If you want to see me, I would like it to be because you cannot think of a good reason not to. Not because it is the proper thing to do with a widow of suitable situation who owns land adjacent to yours." The precision of it, the way she named the hidden motive so directly and demanded he account for it, was the most attractive thing anyone had ever said to him, which was not what he had expected the most attractive thing to be, but there it was. "I cannot think of a good reason not to," he said, "and I have been trying because it would be simpler." She looked at him for a moment, and then the thing that was almost a smile on his face found its answer in something warm and real that crossed her features. "Then come for supper on Thursday," she said. "I will make something from the garden." He came for supper on Thursday, and on the following Thursday, and on most of the Thursdays after that through the autumn. He also started stopping by on other days with less pretext and more obvious purpose, and Ella accepted these visits with the same calm practicality she applied to everything, which did not at all disguise the fact that she had started wearing her second-best dress on the days she thought he might come. Jedediah discovered, over those October and November visits, things about Ella Brenner that deepened his feeling in ways he had not anticipated. She was funny, in a dry, oblique way that did not announce itself as humor. She was smarter than anyone he had met in years, including the men he did business with in Austin and San Antonio, and she had no patience for the social convention of hiding this. She was also, beneath the competence and the practical directness, someone who had been very lonely for a very long time and had organized her life to make the loneliness productive rather than destructive, which was a kind of courage he recognized from the inside. He began to tell her things he did not tell other people. About the pressure of the Double W's finances, which looked solid from the outside, but were more complicated than the town assumed. About the land purchase he had been attempting in the north part of the valley that kept stalling due to a territorial dispute. About the foreman he had had before Cass, a man named Ridley, who had been stealing from him for 2 years before Jedediah discovered it, and the particular darkness that kind of betrayal leaves in a man who trusted someone completely. She listened to all of it with the full attention she gave everything, and she asked questions that cut straight to the relevant point, and she never told him what he wanted to hear if what was true was something different, which was occasionally uncomfortable and constantly necessary. By December they were understood by the town to be something, though what exactly that something was, neither of them had formally said. Ella would not be rushed, and Jedediah, who rushed everything in business, found he did not want to rush this. He wanted to do it right in a way he had never particularly cared about doing anything right before, which told him something about the magnitude of what was happening. It was in December that the dark past arrived. His name was Gerald Marsh, and he came to Harlan Creek on the freight stage on a Tuesday, which was not significant in itself, except that Gerald Marsh had been the business partner of Ella Brenner's late husband Thomas, and the partnership had ended badly, and there was money involved that had never been properly accounted for. Ella knew Gerald Marsh was in town within hours of his arrival, because Harlan Creek was a small town and information moved through it like water through sandy soil. She told Jedediah about it that evening when he had come by in his now regular pattern, and she told him with a flatness in her voice that he had learned to recognize as the sign of something that disturbed her more than she intended to show. He claims Thomas owed him money from a business arrangement that went wrong in Missouri, she said. He is wrong. Thomas dissolved that partnership legally before we left Missouri. I have the papers. Then it is a simple matter, Jedediah said. It is not simple, she said, and the flatness hardened. Gerald Marsh is the kind of man who uses legal structures the way a trap uses bait. The apparent claim is never the real claim. I do not know yet what he actually wants. She was right, as it turned out, and what Marsh actually wanted was the land. He had done his research before coming to Harlan Creek, which meant he had discovered that Ella Brenner owned 40 acres along Crooked Creek with water rights, and he had done sufficient further research to determine that this land was desirable to the Double W operation, and he had constructed a framework of paperwork that would be difficult to untangle quickly. He filed a claim at the land registry, asserting that a debt owed to him by Thomas Brenner had been secured against the land before the formal dissolution of the partnership, and that the dissolution did not therefore clear the security. It was designed to be confusing, and to force Ella into a position where she needed to sell quickly to someone with ready cash, Gerald Marsh, at a low price to avoid a drawn-out legal process she could not afford. Jedediah learned all of this because he went to the land registry himself and read the filing with the cold, precise attention of a man who had dealt with enough territorial land disputes to recognize a manufactured crisis when he saw one. He also sent a telegraph to his lawyer in Austin, a sharp man named Dodd, and received back a reply that confirmed his assessment. The claim was almost certainly invalid but would require documentation from Missouri to disprove, and documentation from Missouri took time, and time in winter on a frontier parcel was not something a woman alone could afford to waste. He also, while thinking about this, thought about something else. about the fact that Ella's land was exactly the land he had been trying to buy for 3 years, about the fact that Gerald Marsh's manufactured crisis was in certain structural ways similar to the kind of pressure Jedediah himself might have considered applying in his earlier, harder-edged days of land acquisition, before Ella Brenner had rearranged certain of his internal priorities. He sat with that uncomfortable parallel for a long time, and then he went to Ella's cabin and told her about the telegraph to Austin and the opinion he had received, and he told her he wanted to help, and she looked at him with the gray storm eyes and said, "What would your help require in return?" The question landed like a slap, because it was fair. Because she had not forgotten the origin of their acquaintance, which was his desire for her land. Because she was not a woman who forgot things, and she was not a woman who trusted without reason, and she was asking him in plain terms whether the help came with a hidden motive. "Nothing," he said. "It would require nothing." "Jedediah," she said. His name in her voice, which usually moved him, now carried a weight of warning. "It would require nothing," he said again, and he meant it, and he needed her to know he meant it, and he did not know how to prove something like that except to say it and then demonstrate it over time, which was exactly the problem with trust. It could not be shortened. She let him help. She wrote to Missouri for the documents she needed, and Jedediah's lawyer in Austin began the process of challenging Marsh's filing on procedural grounds. The challenge would take weeks, but it was solid. And for a time, for what felt like a very bright, particular period of time in the middle of the Texas winter, everything between Jedediah and Ella moved toward something good. He spent Christmas Day at her cabin, the first time he had not spent Christmas at the Double W in 12 years. She cooked with what she had preserved from the garden, a meal that was better than most, and they sat by the small fireplace in the cabin and talked until it was late enough that he ought to have left an hour previous. He kissed her that evening in the doorway, and it was careful and honest, and nothing like the polite social behavior he had offered to engage in that October night. And Ella's hands came up to the lapels of his coat and held on for a moment after, which told him everything he needed to know. The new year arrived, and with it the answer from Missouri. The documents Ella needed were confirmed to exist and would be sent, but the process was slower than expected, because the Missouri clerk had misfiled the original partnership dissolution under the wrong name. Gerald Marsh, who had clearly anticipated some version of this delay, moved in the first week of January. He went to the land registry with a second filing, this one asserting emergency status due to the unresolved nature of the first claim, which in the territory's legal code created an automatic 60-day suspension of any transactions on the land in question, including the water rights. If the water rights were suspended, Ella had no legal access to Crooked Creek during the suspension period. In January, with the creek already reduced by winter drought, this was designed to cripple her ability to maintain the property. It was also, Jedediah learned in a conversation with Cass Dooley that he had not expected, and which changed everything, not the only thing Marsh was doing. Cass came to Jedediah's study on a January evening with the expression of a man delivering difficult news he has been carrying for too long. He sat down when Jedediah gestured to the chair, which was itself unusual, because Cass generally preferred to stand. "I need to tell you something," Cass said. "About Marsh." Jedediah waited. "He came to me," Cass said, "a week ago. He knew who I was, knew I worked for you. He had information, or said he did, about the northern land dispute, the territorial claim you have been working on. He said he could make it go away if I passed him certain information about Mrs. Brenner's situation, about her finances, about what she has told you." The silence that followed was the quiet kind that has a great deal of temperature. "What did you tell him?" Jedediah said. "I told him no," Cass said. "I want you to know that first and clear. But I also want you to know he approached me, because it means he is working multiple angles, and if he did not get what he wanted from me, he will find another way." Jedediah looked at his foreman, a man he had trusted for 9 years, who had just confirmed that trust by turning down something valuable and telling him why, and felt both gratitude and the cold clarity of understanding exactly what Gerald Marsh was. "Thank you," he said. "There is one more thing," Cass said. "He mentioned you by name when he was trying to persuade me. He said Watkins has been trying to get that land for 3 years, and that you would find a way to get it one way or another, and that I might as well profit from the situation since the outcome for the widow was the same regardless. He was trying to suggest that your interest in Mrs. Brenner was a version of the same approach." Jedediah sat very still. "I know it is not," Cass said quietly. "Does the town know he was making that argument?" Jedediah asked. "I do not know what he has said to others," Cass said. Jedediah went to Ella the next morning, and he told her everything Cass had reported, without softening or strategic omission, because she had asked him for honesty and he had promised it. He told her about the northern land dispute and what Marsh had offered to do with it, and he told her about Marsh's suggestion regarding his own motives. Ella listened to all of it without interrupting. When he finished, she was quiet for a moment, and then she said, "Is any of what he implied true? At any point in any degree?" It was the question that had no comfortable answer, and he knew it, and she knew he knew it, which was why she asked it straight. "At the start," he said, "I came to see you because I wanted the land. That was true. It stopped being the main reason very quickly. I cannot give you the exact point where it changed, but it changed. What I feel now has nothing to do with the land. You know that I have been offered a fair price for acreage adjacent to yours that gives me the water access I need. I declined it 2 months ago." "You declined it," she said. "Because I did not want a solution to a property matter that I had already stopped caring about in those terms." She stood very still in the kitchen of her cabin, looking at him. "I need to think," she said. "I know," he said. "I need you to give me time to think without coming by," she said. "A few days." "Yes," he said. He picked up his hat and then he stopped at the door. "The papers from Missouri will arrive in the next 2 weeks. Dodd in Austin will handle the legal challenge. You do not need me to solve this. I want you to know that, separate from everything else, you have what you need." She did not answer, and he left. The few days stretched to a week, and then to 2, and Jedediah understood the silence as a message, and respected it even as it hollowed something out in him that he had not known he could afford to lose. He ran the ranch. He managed the legal process through Dodd. He did not ride past her fence. The Missouri papers arrived on a Thursday in late January, 10 days after his last visit. He knew they had arrived because Dodd telegraphed him. He forwarded the telegraph information to Ella through Abel Dooley, who could be trusted, with no other message. Gerald Marsh's claims collapsed within a week of the Missouri documentation entering the local court process. The land registry clerk, a different one from the nervous young man who had processed Ella's original paperwork, reviewed the filing and the counter-documentation and withdrew the suspension. Marsh had no remaining legal avenue and left Harlan Creek on the stage 2 days later without speaking to anyone. Ella was free and clear. Jedediah waited another 3 days, and then he could not wait any more, and he rode to her parcel on a cold February morning with no prepared speech and no strategy, and nothing to offer except what he was, which was a man who had made mistakes and known it, and changed specific things, and could not change others, and loved her without having intended to, and needed her to know it in plain terms. She was in her garden when he arrived, which was unexpected in February, but Ella Brenner did not stop tending things because the season made it difficult. She was turning the winter soil, preparing it for spring, working the ground with a fork in the cold morning air with the methodical intensity that characterized everything she did. She heard his horse and looked up, and she watched him dismount and come to the gate of the garden, and her face was unreadable in the careful way that meant she was reading his. He stopped at the gate. He looked at her, and at the turned winter soil, and at the whole extraordinary, improbable garden she had built from nothing in a place that had tried to defeat her at every turn, and something in him that had been held in a particular tightly organized posture for 32 years came loose. He opened the gate and stepped inside and knelt down beside the winter earth, one knee in the cold dirt, and he looked up at her. "Tell me what to plant," he said, "and I will do the rest." The words were not planned. They arrived because they were true. Because they were the most precise expression of what he was offering, which was not a business arrangement or a social contract or even a declaration in the traditional sense, but something more specific and more honest. That he was willing to learn, to follow her lead, to put his hands and his time and his considerable capacity for work into whatever she directed, not because he had decided the garden was a good investment, but because she was the most important thing in it, and he would do whatever it took to be worthy of that. Ella Brenner looked at Jedediah Watkins kneeling in the dirt of her garden with his hat in his hands and his pride abandoned entirely, and she felt the last thing she had been holding against him, not the land issue, not Marsh's implications, but the older, colder fear of another loss she could not survive soften. She had known for weeks that the implied motive was not the real one. She had known it, honestly, since October, since the evening on the main street when he had answered her question about what he wanted with a candor that had cost him something. She had needed the distance and the difficulty to be certain of her own heart rather than his, because she was the one who had to live inside it. She looked at him kneeling in her garden in February and understood that he was not asking about plants. "Beans first," she said softly. "Along the south fence because the fence will support them. Then squash in the center because they spread and need room. Then the herbs along the east border, close to the cabin, where I can reach them easily." He stayed on one knee for another moment, holding her gaze, and then he rose and took the fork from her hands, and she showed him where to begin. They worked the garden together that morning until the sun was fully up and the coffee in the cabin had gone cold, and when they came inside and she reheated it on the small stove and handed him a cup, his hands were dirty in exactly the same way hers were, which was the most domestic and the most significant thing that had ever happened in that kitchen. "I want to ask you something," he said, holding the coffee cup. "I know," she said. "I have not said it yet." "You have been building to it for 4 months," she said, and there was warmth in the gray eyes now unguarded. "Ask it. Will you marry me?" he said. It was not quite a question and not quite a statement, which was his way when he was certain of what he meant but uncertain of the ground beneath him. She looked at him across the small kitchen table in the winter morning light. "Yes," she said, "but I keep the garden." "The garden," he said, "is not in question. And I keep this land," she said, "in my name." He nodded slowly. "I would have it no other way. And you will eat what I grow here and tell me honestly what you think of it, not what you think I want to hear." "Ella," he said, "I have never in my life told someone what they wanted to hear in preference to what was true, and I do not plan to begin now." "Good," she said. "Then yes, I will marry you, Jedediah Watkins, and you had better mean what you said about the planting." He reached across the table and took her hand, and she let him hold it, and the cold February morning outside went on being cold and beautiful in the way of seasons that are preparing to become something else. They were married in April in the Harlan Creek Church, by the Reverend Cartwright, who was a serious man, and conducted the ceremony with appropriate gravity, and also, at the dinner afterward, turned out to be an enthusiastic dancer, which surprised everyone including his wife. The wedding was a town event. Harlan Creek did not have many occasions to celebrate, and it seized this one with dedication. Ella wore a dress that had belonged to her mother, altered to fit the frontier year, and her hair was still pinned back because it was who she was, but she had allowed the doctor's wife, Martha Gilroy, to weave small white flowers into it, which gave the severity a softness that made Jedediah, standing at the front of the church, simply stop thinking for a moment when she came through the door. He did not cry. He was not a man who cried in public, or possibly at all, though Ella would later express a different opinion on this matter. But he stood very still watching her walk toward him with the particular stillness of a man, experiencing something he does not have an adequate word for. And Cass Dooley, standing beside him as best man, said afterward that he had never seen Jedediah Watkins look like that about anything, which seemed to Cass to suggest that the world was more various and interesting than he had previously appreciated. The vows were the traditional ones, spoken by both of them with the focused directness that was their shared characteristic. And when Reverend Cartwright said Jedediah might kiss his bride, Jedediah did so with a care and intention that made Martha Gilroy press her handkerchief to her eyes, and the fiddle player Pete, who had been hired again, start up prematurely out of enthusiasm and have to stop again. They went back to the Double W Ranch after the celebration, because the Double W had more space, and because Ella had agreed to manage both the garden on her parcel and the broader domestic life of the ranch, which needed significant improvement. What she found when she arrived at the Double W house was a large, practical, underdecorated building that had been run by men who prioritized function above all else, and she looked at it with the appraising eye of someone who sees what something is and what it could be simultaneously. "It needs a great deal of work," she said. "Yes," Jedediah agreed. "I will start with the kitchen," she said. "Start wherever you like," he said. "It is your home." She turned and looked at him, at the way he had said those words, without caveat or qualification, with the matter-of-fact certainty that he applied to all statements of fact, and something in her expression settled into something that was not the careful composure she wore in public, but something richer and more private, the face beneath the face that she was only beginning to allow him to see. "Thank you," she said quietly, "for more than the kitchen." The first year of their marriage was the kind of year that builds a life rather than decorates one. They learned each other with the thorough attention of two people who understand that intimacy is not given but constructed, and who bring to the construction the same focused seriousness they bring to everything else. Jedediah learned that Ella woke earlier than anyone he had ever lived with, that she read in bed for an hour each morning before she would speak to anyone, and that if you interrupted this hour, the consequences were not dramatic, but were noticeable and lasting. He learned that she had a dark past of her own that she carried in a carefully organized internal space. Not only the grief for Thomas, but an older wound from a father who had not believed women needed education, and had been overridden in this belief by a mother who had educated Ella in secret, until the secret was unnecessary. This history was what had made Ella so precise about what she wanted, and so intolerant of people who expected her to want less than she did. He learned also, and to his considerable surprise, that she found him funny, that she could convulse with genuine laughter at things he said deadpan with no intention of humor, and that the discovery of this made him happy in a way that was entirely disproportionate to the act of making someone laugh, and that he therefore suspected was not actually about the jokes. Ella learned that Jedediah was more tender than his exterior suggested, which she had suspected, and that the tenderness expressed itself in practical ways. In the fact that he noticed what she needed before she asked for it, in the way he came to the garden without being invited on evenings when he could see she was tired, in the books he started finding for her in the same way Thomas had found them, which initially caused her a complicated grief, and eventually caused her something else entirely, which was the understanding that it was possible to love two very different people in two very different ways, and that the second love was not a diminishment of the first, but something complete in itself. She learned that Jedediah's pride was not vanity but armor, built over years of a childhood that had offered vulnerability nothing but punishment, and that when he let it down, which he did, in the private spaces of their life, what showed beneath it was not the expected weakness, but something that was harder and finer, a quality she could not name precisely except to say that it was the reason she trusted him entirely. By June of 1879, a year after Ella had first turned the soil on her parcel, the garden was in its second full season, and producing enough to supply a quarter of Harlan Creek's households with vegetables through the summer. She had also started a small operation selling preserved goods through Horace Gill's store, jams and pickles and dried herbs, that generated enough income to feel genuinely useful, and which gave her a position in the town's economy that was her own, rather than an extension of the Double W. Jedediah planted the south fence row with beans himself. In the spring, following her instructions with the methodical precision he brought to fence building and cattle management. And the beans grew with the gratifying certainty of things, planted correctly at the right time in properly prepared soil. He also, in May of 1879, finally resolved the northern land dispute, not through the complex territorial legal process that had been dragging for 3 years, but through a negotiation with the neighboring rancher that Ella had suggested in November, which involved a water-sharing arrangement that gave both parties what they actually needed rather than what they had been fighting over. The simplicity of the solution, once articulated, embarrassed him slightly, and he told Ella this, and she said, with the dry precision that still made him stop and recalibrate, "Most fights are about something other than what they appear to be about. You were fighting about land. You both needed water." "I should have seen that sooner," he said. "You were thinking about other things," she said, and the look she gave him from across the kitchen table made the conversation take a different direction entirely. In the autumn of 1879, Ella told him she was expecting their first child. She told him in the garden because she found the garden to be the most honest place she knew, and honesty was how she operated. She was examining the squash vines for the last of the season's harvest, and he had come out to help in the way he now did without announcement, and she straightened up and turned to face him with the particular focused directness that he associated with things of importance. "I expect we will need to think about the spare room," she said. He looked at her for a moment and then he understood. The reaction that crossed his face, and he was not a man whose face said much to the average observer, was, to Ella, entirely legible. It was relief and terror, and something so clear and uncomplicated that she felt the prick of tears, which she disliked in public and allowed freely in private. He crossed the garden rows to her and took her face in his hands, those big cattleman's hands that had been offered open in this same garden a year ago, and he held her carefully and said nothing for a moment because there was nothing to say that would be adequate. "We will need to think about several rooms," he said finally, and the thing that was almost a smile was fully a smile now, which was something that had happened with much more frequency in the past year. She laughed, which was the sound he liked best in the world, and he kissed her in the garden in the October afternoon, and the whole valley below them went on in its own business, indifferent and beautiful. Their son was born in the spring of 1880, in March, on a clear cold morning when the first of the early wildflowers were coming up along the creek beds. He was healthy and loud, which Jedediah considered excellent signs in a Watkins, and Ella looked at him in the exhausted aftermath of a difficult labor and said, "He has your jaw. He will be impossible." "He will be fine," Jedediah said, holding the boy with the careful attention of a man learning the weight of something entirely new, "because he will have your good sense to counterbalance it." They named him Thomas Jedediah Watkins, which meant something to both of them that they did not need to articulate aloud, because they had learned that some things communicated more precisely in action than in words. Young Thomas Watkins grew through the spring and summer of 1880 with the particular urgency of healthy babies, and the Double W accommodated itself to his presence with the adaptability of a place that had always been run by someone determined. Ella managed the baby and the ranch's domestic life, and the garden with a logistical efficiency that impressed even Jedediah, which was saying something, and also allowed herself to be overwhelmed sometimes, and told him about it directly instead of managing alone, which was the most significant change she had made from her prior years, and which she had found, against some expectation, made things better rather than worse. Jedediah, for his part, discovered that fatherhood rearranged certain priorities with a speed and thoroughness that he had not predicted. He did not stop being a cattleman or a businessman or a man of this particular hard country, but the armor that had once covered everything softened around the edges in ways that Harlan Creek noticed and commented on, mostly approvingly, though the two men in the saloon who had bet on the marriage lasting less than 2 years did so less approvingly. By the summer of 1880, Ella's garden on the Brenner parcel had become something she was proud of in the fullest sense, not the modest, careful pride she had learned to wear as protection, but the unguarded kind. She had added fruit trees, 2 apple and 1 pear, planted in the fall of the prior year with Jedediah's help, and she had expanded the vegetable beds and added a dedicated herb section and begun keeping careful records of what worked and what failed and why, with the intention of eventually writing something useful about frontier kitchen gardening that other women in similar circumstances could use. The record-keeping was Jedediah's idea, or rather, he had noticed her talking through her planting decisions with a clarity and depth of knowledge that deserved to be preserved, and he had brought her a proper journal from the supply store in town and suggested it, and she had looked at him with the gray eyes gone bright and said, "You think someone would read it?" "I think," he said, "that there are a great many women in a great many frontier situations who would find it invaluable, and that you are the person qualified to write it, and that I would read it myself." She had started writing that week. The summer of 1880 was good to Harlan Creek and to the W. The rains came at the right times, which in Texas in the 1880s was a miracle you accepted without questioning. The cattle did well. The garden produced beyond its previous best. Young Thomas, 5 months old by August, discovered his own hands with a philosophical concentration that Ella found enormously funny and Jedediah found, privately, among the more interesting things he had ever observed. Everett Cross, the schoolteacher who had danced with Ella at the autumn social 2 years prior, married the daughter of the blacksmith in July and invited the Watkinses to the wedding, and Ella danced with Jedediah at the reception, which was the first time he had ever danced in public, and which he undertook with the focused determination he brought to things he had decided to do regardless of whether he was good at them. He was not entirely good at it. Ella was patient, and then she was laughing, and he decided that being laughed at by Ella in a warm, affectionate way was something he could tolerate indefinitely. In the autumn of 1880, Ella's gardening journal was written to a length that she considered meaningful, and she shared it with Jedediah, who read all of it with the same focused attention he gave everything she made, and then looked up and said, "I know a printer in San Antonio. Dodd knows him. We could have copies made." The journal was printed that winter, a modest run of 50 copies, through a contact of the lawyer Dodd's in San Antonio. Ella sent copies to women's groups in several Texas towns and to a homesteading society in Kansas, and the response came back over the following months in the form of letters that arrived at the Harlan Creek post office in surprising numbers, from women who had never spoken to anyone about the specific challenges of growing food in hard circumstances, who had read Ella's precise and practical and quietly personal account and felt, many of them said, less alone. Ella read these letters at the kitchen table of the W and was quiet for a long time. "What are you thinking?" Jedediah asked. "I am thinking," she said, "that Thomas would have found a book exactly like this for me if it had existed when I needed it." "Yes," Jedediah said, "he would have." She looked at him. "And you made one exist." "You wrote it," he said. "I found the printer." "That is," she said, "an extremely Thomas thing to have done." He held her gaze for a moment, and there was nothing uncomfortable in the comparison, because he had learned that loving Ella meant understanding the whole of who she was, including the love she still carried for a gentle man who had found her books and believed in her, and not survived long enough to see what she became. The love he had for her was large enough to include that, and the understanding of this had been, in its own way, the final thing that had completed the architecture of what they were. "I merely recognized what was there," he said. She stood up from the table and crossed to where he was sitting and put her arms around him, which was a direct, unguarded tenderness that she was more capable of now than she had been 2 years ago, and which he received with a stillness that was entirely the opposite of the closed stillness of his old armor, and entirely its own different thing. "I love you," she said, into the collar of his shirt. She had said it before, she said it regularly, but she never said it as a reflex, and it was always true and specific. "I love you," he said into her hair, unreservedly, without any of the hidden motives or dark past calculations that I arrived in your garden with. She laughed, which vibrated through him in a way that had not gotten less over 2 years of this. "Most of the hidden motives," she said. "Most," he agreed. "You have the land. The water access is resolved. The garden is yours and always was. All the hidden motives have been accounted for and surrendered." "Good," she said, "because I am going to need your hands again in the spring. The apple trees want a second companion planting, and I have a plan for the eastern border that requires someone with your particular combination of stubbornness and upper body strength." "I am at your direction," he said, "entirely." "I know," she said. "That is exactly why I married you." The winter of 1880 into 1881 was a cold one, the kind that tested even well-prepared operations, and the W was tested. A livestock illness moved through the valley cattle herds in January, not devastating but serious, and Jedediah managed it with the competence of experience, while Ella managed the household and the baby and several of the hands' families who needed assistance through the difficult stretch. She organized food distribution from the garden stores she had preserved through the fall with the same quiet efficiency she organized everything. And at the end of January, when the illness had passed and the count had been taken and the losses were less than feared, the hands who worked the W had a clearer sense than ever of what kind of people ran the operation they worked for. Cass Dooley, over a cup of coffee in the kitchen one February morning while Jedediah was out checking the recovered cattle, told Ella that he had worked for the W for 9 years and that the first 8 had been good years and the 9th was different. "How so?" she asked. "The first 8, Cass said. It was a good ranch. Well-run, fair pay, solid operation. Watkins was a hard man but a fair one, and that is more than most." He paused. "Now it is a home. There is a difference I did not know to name until I saw it." Ella considered this. "He was always capable of it," she said. "He was waiting for a reason." "Yes," Cass said, "he was." Spring came to the valley in 1881, with the particular extravagance of springs that follow hard winters, as if the land was compensating. The wildflowers were abundant along Crooked Creek, and the apple trees in the Brenner garden put out their first real blossoms, and young Thomas Watkins, 1 year old and newly walking with the stumbling conviction of someone who has decided to trust his legs despite insufficient evidence, made his first tour of the garden under Ella's supervision, stopping to examine dirt and pebbles with an intensity that she found philosophically appropriate for someone at the beginning of understanding the world. Jedediah planted the south fence row beans again, and the companion planting on the east border that Ella had designed over the winter, and the new section she had planned for an expanded herb bed, following her directions with the steady, applied effort that he brought to everything. And if the beans had once been a metaphor for his willingness to change, they were now simply part of the rhythm of the year, part of what the Watkinses did together, which was work and build and grow things. By early summer, Ella told him they were expecting their second child. She told him in the garden again, because she was who she was. This time he simply pulled her into his arms before she had finished the sentence, because he had learned something about responding to important news, and she laughed into his shoulder and said, "You did not let me finish." "I did not need to," he said. Their second child, a daughter, was born in November of 1881, small and determined and immediately in possession of opinions, which Jedediah regarded as inevitable and which Ella regarded as personally satisfying. They named her Me, for Ella's mother, who had found ways for her daughter to learn when learning was forbidden, which seemed to them both a quality worth honoring. Harlan Creek grew through those years, as Texas grew through those years, which is to say unevenly, sometimes painfully, often beautifully. The cattle industry boomed and then complicated itself with the economics of the railroads reaching deeper into the territory. The small farmers and homesteaders pushed against the big ranches, and the politics of water and land that had always shaped the frontier became more formal and more contested. Jedediah navigated all of it with the combination of experience and the particular kind of practical wisdom that had developed over years of being corrected by someone whose judgment he trusted more than his own stubbornness. There was a town meeting in the spring of 1882 about water rights upstream that threatened several smaller operations, and Jedediah went to it having been talked through the relevant considerations by Ella the night before, who had a view on the matter that was different from the purely business view, which included the injustice of what the unrestricted water claims of the largest operations did to the families trying to build small homesteads. He went to the meeting and argued for a fair allocation framework that cost the W something but preserved the smaller operations, which surprised the meeting considerably, and afterward the homesteader named Birch, who had been one of those most threatened, came and shook Jedediah's hand and said, "I did not expect that from you, Mr. Watkins." "My wife had something to say about it," Jedediah said honestly, "and she was right." Birch looked at him for a moment and then laughed, which was a surprised laugh, the kind that comes when something is more genuine than expected. The W by 1882 was a different operation from the one Jedediah had built in the years before Ella, not smaller or less capable, but different in character, the kind of difference that shows in how people are treated and what priorities are kept, and what the place feels like to the people in it. The hands who worked there stayed longer than the average for the territory, which was its own kind of testimony. Ella's garden on the Brenner parcel had become, by 1882, something that people came to see, not as a tourist attraction but as a reference, a working example of what was possible on difficult frontier soil with sufficient knowledge and attention. The women of Harlan Creek visited to ask questions. The homesteader families visited to learn. A woman named Clara Birch, the wife of the homesteader whose hand Jedediah had shaken, came in the spring of 1882 and sat with Ella in the garden for 2 hours asking about soil preparation and companion planting and frost protection, and went home with seeds from Ella's own stock and a list of recommendations written out in Ella's precise hand. "You are teaching," Jedediah said that evening. "I am answering questions," Ella said. "The distinction," he said, "is smaller than you think." She looked at him with the gray eyes that he had learned every shade and gradient of, and something settled in her face that was the expression she wore when she understood something she had not quite articulated to herself. "Thomas believed I should have been allowed to teach properly," she said. "Not just gardening, everything." "He was right," Jedediah said. "He was," she said, and then quietly, "So are you." In the fall of 1882, Ella formally organized what she had been doing informally, establishing a twice-monthly gathering at the Harlan Creek Church where women could share agricultural knowledge, discuss the practical problems of frontier household management, and, incidentally, support one another in the various difficulties that frontier life created for women without adequate recourse. She did not call it anything that sounded alarming. She called it the Harlan Creek Kitchen Garden Society, and it met on the first and third Thursday, and within 3 months it had 14 regular members and a waiting list. Jedediah attended the inaugural meeting on the principle that he would support whatever Ella built, and discovered that he was the only man there, and that this was fine, and that the conversations happening in that room were more practically intelligent than most of the conversations happening in the county land office, which he told Ella on the way home, and which made her laugh in the full, unguarded way that still, after 4 years, made him feel like the luckiest and most unreasonably fortunate man in the territory. The winters grew less difficult as the house grew more itself, which is to say more Ella's, which is to say warmer and more full of things that were carefully chosen rather than simply functional. Books arrived steadily, because Jedediah had established an arrangement with a bookseller in San Antonio through the same connection that had printed the gardening journal, and because Ella's reading had expanded to include agricultural science and women's education materials that were beginning to circulate more widely in the early 1880s. And because young Thomas had opinions about stories before he could read them himself, and me had already demonstrated a disposition to eat corners of pages she disagreed with. The children grew as children do, faster than seems reasonable, with the acceleration of days that Ella had been warned about and still found astonishing. Thomas, serious and curious and possessed of his father's focused intensity, directed toward entirely different subjects, primarily animals and the mechanics of how things worked, was by his third birthday clearly going to be a child who asked questions until the questioner gave up, which suited the W admirably, and would suit the world, Ella thought, moderately well as long as someone helped him develop an awareness that not everyone found all of his questions welcome. Me was different, the way second children are different, not in degree of intelligence or significance, but in the specific shape of a personality that has formed with the knowledge of an older sibling already present, which gives a child a certain practice in making her presence felt through channels other than simple need. She was social in a way Thomas was not, inclined to observe people with an interest that was less analytical than her mother's and more instinctive, quick to read emotional states in others and quicker to respond to them, which Ella suspected would either make her enormously effective in the world or thoroughly exhausted by it, and possibly both. By the spring of 1883, the W was the prosperous and humane operation that Jedediah had built toward without always knowing that was what he was building toward. The cattle numbered over 300. The land, including Ella's parcel which remained in her name, ran to nearly 600 acres. The hands were good people who were well managed by Cass Dooley, who had been offered the foreman position originally as a practical matter, and who had become, over the years, something closer to a trusted friend, a category that Jedediah had previously kept to very small numbers. The town of Harlan Creek had grown to over 600 people by 1883, which meant a proper schoolhouse separate from the church, and a second general store, and a doctor who did not also cut hair, and the particular social complexity of a place growing toward townness from frontierness, all of which brought new problems and new possibilities in roughly equal measure. Ella's Kitchen Garden Society had evolved by 1883 into a more broadly organized women's group that, among other things, raised funds for the new schoolhouse and advocated successfully for the hiring of a second teacher who was a woman, the first in Harlan Creek's history. Ella did not give a speech about this. She simply made arguments in the right rooms to the right people with the directness and documentation that she applied to everything, and then the decision was made and she went back to the garden. Jedediah watched her operate in the world with a pride that was the opposite of the pride he had carried before she arrived, which had been about himself. This pride was about her, and it was entirely uncomplicated, the purest version of the feeling. In the summer of 1883, Ella discovered she was expecting their third child. She told him at the breakfast table this time because they had been at this long enough that the garden framing was optional. "A third," he said. "A third," she confirmed. "The spare room has been occupied by Thomas for 2 years," he said. "I know," she said. "We will need to think about the house." He nodded, already running the practical calculations, and then he stopped running the practical calculations and reached across the table and took her hand because the practical calculations could wait. "Are you well?" he asked. "Yes," she said. "I am well, Jedediah. I am better than well." He looked at her across the breakfast table in the morning light of the ranch house that was now thoroughly and entirely their home. And he thought about a February morning 5 years prior, when he had knelt in the winter dirt of her garden with his hat in his hands and no plan except honesty. And he thought about what that moment had opened. And he understood that the pride he had walked into her garden with the pride of a man who owned the valley and knew it, and needed everyone else to know it too, had been the least of what he had. It had been the front of something. Behind it was this. The third child, another son, was born in January of 1884, healthy and large in the way of Watkins babies, and they named him Daniel, for no ancestor or obligation but simply because the name fit him, and because Ella, holding him in the aftermath of his arrival, had said, "He is Daniel. He looks like a Daniel," with the certainty she brought to all her assessments, and Jedediah, looking at the baby and then at the woman who had changed every important thing, had agreed. Daniel was indeed very much a Daniel. By his first spring, he had a quality of settled certainty in his presence that was its own category, different from Thomas's focused intensity and me's social perceptiveness, something quieter and more foundational, as if he had arrived already knowing that the world was a workable place. The Double W that year was running as well as it had ever run, and the valley around Harlan Creek was experiencing the relative stability of a frontier that had passed its most violent chapter, though violence had not entirely gone, and the injustices baked into the structures of the territory. In the treatment of the Comanche and the Apache who had been pushed from their lands, in the legal and practical disadvantages of women and of the poor, were not resolved by the passage of time, and Ella knew it, and said so when it was relevant, which Jedediah had stopped being surprised by and had come to depend on. There was a particular evening in the summer of 1884 when they sat on the porch of the ranch house in the warm Texas dark, Thomas asleep inside and me barely asleep and Daniel most emphatically awake in the basket between them, and Ella said, looking at the stars that were the one extravagant beauty the territory offered without reserve, "I used to think surviving was the best I could hope for. After Thomas died," Jedediah said. "Before that, even," she said. "For most of my life, really. Surviving in the sense of getting through, of making the difficult thing manageable." She paused. "I did not know the difference between surviving and living until I came here." He was quiet for a moment. "I did not know the difference between building and living," he said. "I had built a great deal. I had not noticed that I was doing it in an empty room." She turned her head to look at him in the darkness. "It is not empty now," she said. "No," he agreed. "It is not." Daniel made a sound in the basket that was either contentment or its opposite, and Ella picked him up with the practiced ease of a mother on her third, and Jedediah put his arm around her shoulder as she settled the baby, and the summer dark went on around them, and the stars were very clear over the Texas valley, and everything that needed to be said had been said, and they sat in the comfortable, specific quiet of people who have built something real together. The apple trees in Ella's garden bore their first full fruit in the autumn of 1884, 4 years after planting, and the apples were excellent. She made pies because the children required pies, and she made preserves because the winter required preserves, and she brought a basket to the Kitchen Garden Society meeting where they were consumed with great appreciation, and the recipe was requested and given freely, which was Ella's general policy with knowledge. Jedediah, eating pie at the kitchen table with Thomas on his left asking about the mechanical principles of how apples grew on trees, and me on his right, explaining to her doll why the apple was good, and Daniel in the chair between them dismantling a biscuit, looked at his wife across the table, and found that after 6 years, the particular quality of looking at her had not diminished. If anything, it had deepened in the way that familiarity deepens rather than dulls things when the thing is real. She caught his look and tilted her head in the old considering way. "What?" she said. "Nothing," he said. "The pie is excellent." "It is," she agreed without false modesty. "The apple trees required 4 years," he said. "Yes," she said. "I planted the first seed 6 years ago," he said, "on a February morning in the cold." She understood what he was saying, which was not about trees. "Some things," she said, "take exactly the time they take, and then they are entirely worth it." Thomas interrupted to ask whether apple seeds knew from the beginning that they would become trees, which opened a conversation about seeds and potential and knowledge that lasted through the rest of supper and into bedtime, and which was exactly the kind of conversation that filled the Double W's evenings now, layered and ongoing and continuously interesting, and which Jedediah engaged with as fully and attentively as he engaged with everything in his life that mattered to him, which had turned out, against the arithmetic of a man who had once measured value primarily in acres and cattle, to be a great many things. The years settled into themselves as years do, each one building on the last the way garden seasons build, the soil improving with each cycle, the plants growing stronger in ground that has been worked and understood. The children grew up with the valley as their landscape, and the ranch as their home, and the garden as a fact of life, something that was always there and always tended and always producing, which is perhaps not the worst thing a child can grow up knowing. Harlan Creek in the mid-1880s was a proper town, with a school that Ella had been instrumental in shaping, and a women's organization that she had founded, and a garden that everyone knew, and a cattleman who had changed in ways the town respected more than it had expected to. The Double W remained the largest operation in the valley, but it held that position differently than it had before Ella Brenner arrived on the Southern Pacific Line in the spring of 1878 with 2 trunks and a satchel of seed packets. On the occasion of their 5th wedding anniversary, in April of 1884, Jedediah gave Ella a copy of her gardening journal that he had reprinted with a proper binding from the San Antonio printer, with a new preface added that she had not written, and that he had therefore written himself, in the careful, precise language of a man who said exactly what he meant. The preface said, "This book was written by Ella Watkins, formerly Ella Brenner, in the kitchen of a frontier cabin in Harlan Creek, Texas, from knowledge earned through loss and determination, and the particular stubbornness of a woman who believed that things could grow in difficult soil if tended with sufficient care. The author is not solely an authority on kitchen gardens. She is, in the experience of at least one person who has had the considerable fortune to know her work firsthand, an authority on what it means to tend things well. The instruction in this book is practical and excellent, and I recommend it without reservation. The instruction that is not in this book, which is how to see a piece of hard ground and know what it could be, is not something that can be written down. You either see it or you do not. The author sees it, about soil and about people, and has made it her life's work to act on what she sees. I am the primary beneficiary of this practice, and I am grateful for it every day of my life. Ella read the preface 3 times, which was unusual for a woman who read everything once with full comprehension, and then she set the book down on the kitchen table and looked at the man across from her and said nothing for a moment, because nothing was exactly what was needed. Then she said, "Jedediah." "Yes," he said. "Come here," she said. He came around the table and she held his face in her hands, and what she said next she said quietly, so it was only for him. That evening, in the April dusk with the apple trees just beginning to show their spring blossoms through the kitchen window, the Double W was full of the particular noise and warmth of a large, alive household, and the garden on the Brenner parcel had a new row staked along the west fence where Ella intended to plant climbing roses in the spring, because she had decided that a garden that was only practical was missing something. And that 5 years of marriage to a man who had knelt in the winter dirt and offered her his hands had made her believe that some things could be beautiful without needing to justify themselves. And Jedediah Watkins, who had knelt in the dirt of her garden with his pride surrendered, and his hands open, and his heart more exposed than he had ever allowed it to be, had found what he had not known he was building toward in all those years of building, A life that was not just prosperous or successful or even good, but full. Full of a woman who told him the truth, of children who demanded the best of him, of a valley that was more than a ledger of acres, of the particular, irreplaceable satisfaction of growing things in partnership with someone whose direction you trust because you have watched her be right so many times, about soil and about people, and about what matters in the end. The roses bloomed the following May, climbing the west fence of the Brenner garden in the Texas sun, and Ella stood back to look at them one morning in the early light before the heat settled in, Thomas beside her asking about how climbing plants knew which direction to grow, me on her other side declaring the roses were the best thing in the garden, Daniel sitting in the garden path eating dirt with scientific interest. Jedediah came out from the house with coffee and handed a cup to Ella and looked at the roses and at the children and at the whole extraordinary ordinary scene of what they had made, and he did not need to say anything, and neither did she. And the morning went on around them in all its difficult, beautiful, specific, frontier enormity. This was what the kneel in the winter garden had been the beginning of. Not a transaction, not a surrender, not even precisely a declaration. It had been an opening. A man setting down the thing he had been carrying so long he had forgotten it was not part of him, and saying, "Tell me what to plant, and I will do the rest." And a woman who had learned the hard way that the world did not give things freely, but who had also learned in the garden and in the years and in the dailiness of this particular life, that sometimes it gave exactly what was needed. The beans grew along the south fence. The squash spread in the center. The herbs bordered the east wall. The apple trees bore fruit. The climbing roses reached for whatever light was available. And in the house above the valley, and in the garden that Ella had dug from resistant soil with her own hands, everything that had been planted with care and tended with honesty came up strong and true, and went on growing through all the seasons that followed, season after season, the way things do when they are rooted in something real.